Hi, hello, and welcome back to the Wool Sea Knitting channel. My name is Rachel, and this video is Knitting 101, how to get your skills from complete beginner with all the techniques and knowledge you need along the way to make the cozy hats, scarves, mittens, and even sweaters that you have been dreaming of, and stop brain rot in the process. As I film this, it's almost New Year's 2025, and I know this is a time of year when a lot of people are looking for a new hobby or to start fresh and start something new, and I humbly suggest knitting be that for you. This video is heavily inspired by the creator from Carly B's video, Stop Brain Rot, Start Sewing, because I'm a beginner sewist and I found that video to be just so helpful and I wanted to make a knitting equivalent. This video is also for anyone who has started to knit a scarf and gotten deeply discouraged. If there is anything I want you to take away from this video, it is number 1, knitting is easy and fun and you can do it. Number 2, do not start knitting with a scarf. You will not learn a lot. You will have no satisfaction of finishing something and wanting to do the next thing, and it is boring. Anyone who suggests that you do is sabotaging you. There are so many reasons to take up knitting as a hobby. Number 1, it has super low startup costs. You don't have to buy a machine or any sort of specialized set of equipment. You really just need a single pair of knitting needles, a ball of yarn, and a tapestry needle, which is just a big needle you can use to sew in the tail ends of your yarn once you finish a project. It's also a super portable hobby. I knit on the bus on my way to work. I used to knit in class during Zoom school in the pandemic, and I found it really helped me focus on lectures. And I knit almost always when I'm watching TV because it helps me stop myself from pulling up my phone and scrolling mindlessly on one screen while half watching something else on a big screen. Knitting is so good for protecting your attention span, keeping your mental health intact, and gaining confidence and problem-solving skills, and a whole bunch of really cute stuff that you have to tangibly show progress of your skills as you go. I'm kind of short. I struggle to sometimes find sweaters that fit my body, and making them myself has been a great way to learn a little bit more about silhouettes that I like and then make all my sweaters look like that. It is also a lot easier than you might think. I know it can be a little frustrating to start, but once you get down the 2 basic stitches, which is a knit and a purl stitch, you will quickly realize everything in knitting is a variation of the knit or the purl stitch. And it's really not that hard. I promise you it is not. And the reason why I can say that knitting is great for stopping brain rot and is very easy, because I first learned how to knit about 4 years ago when I was recovering from chemotherapy. And if you want to talk brain rot, try 4 rounds of an escalated chemo protocol. Do not get me wrong, I would do it again in a heartbeat. Shout out chemotherapy, I would be dead without it. However, I experienced significant short-term memory issues and cognitive functioning side effects during my course of chemo. If I can learn how to knit by myself using YouTube tutorials recovering from the deep chemo brain rot, I promise you can too. And here's how. So I'm not going to teach you the basic stitches, knitting and purling, but I do want to present to you a sort of pathway from super beginner projects you can start with almost no knowledge besides exactly how to cast on stitches and knit, and then build upon those skills bit by suggesting different patterns that you can use so that eventually you have the skills to confidently tackle any pattern that appeals to you. None of these patterns are things that you absolutely have to make to move on to the next stage. Knitting is a hobby, and first and foremost, your priority should be keeping it fun. If you find things boring or ugly or unappealing, you're probably not going to want to continue, and that defeats the entire purpose. But I am going to give you suggested pattern options and a rationale for why I suggested that pattern at different stages of your knitting journey that I think would be most effective for you. The first very many of these all use the exact same needles, so you don't have to go and buy multiple different types all at once while you're still figuring out if this is even a hobby that you would like. And most of these patterns are free, but as we get farther into the video, I'm going to start suggesting some creators who have created beautiful patterns that I recommend that I think are absolutely worth paying for. Okay, so let's begin with recommended materials. I suggest that if you do not already have a relative or a roommate that you can borrow some from, get thyself to your local Michael's, Joann's, Hobbycraft, Fabricland, Spotlight, and get yourself a pair of 5mm knitting needles. That is a US 8 if you're shopping in the US, and get yourself a pair of circular knitting needles. So unlike the traditional straight knitting needles that you're probably used to seeing on TV, these have much shorter needle tips and are connected by a flexible cord. The reason why I'm suggesting these is because most modern knitting patterns are knit for circular knitting needles, and everything you can do on a straight needle you can do with circulars. However, there are lots of things on circular knitting needles you can't do with straight needles. In terms of cord length, I recommend getting a 16-inch cord or a 32-inch cord. While you're there, buy one ball of an inexpensive 100% cotton yarn in a worsted weight or a size 4. I recommend 100% cotton, and I recommend choosing a bright color, aka not black. It is very difficult to see your stitches in black or navy or any other really dark color, and being able to read your knitting is something that a lot of people struggle with at the beginning, so do yourself a favor, pick a bright color you like. The vast majority of the patterns I recommend are going to be requiring those 5mm needles that I suggest. If you do have access to 5mm straight knitting needles, that's totally fine. You don't have to buy special circular knitting needles just yet. The first few patterns I'm going to recommend are all doable on straight needles as well. Phase 1, ultra beginner, when you already know how to do a basic knit stitch and you know how to cast on stitches. There are 2 patterns that I think are absolutely perfect for you. Number 1 on this list is a dishcloth. This pattern comes in a super clear video tutorial and a written pattern that goes along with it, so you can watch the whole video, learn what you're supposed to be doing by watching very close up visually, and then you can read through the pattern afterwards to see what that looks like in standard knitting notation. It is fast, it is something you can actually use, it doesn't have to be pretty because you're going to be using it to clean up messes, and it will help you practice the knit stitch and the most essential things and get that muscle memory down so that your stitches become more even and your tension starts to sort of stabilize. Because a lot of what this is just muscle memory, and the sooner you get that done, the better. I recommend that you make 1 or 2. That way, no matter what you have is useful. You have the satisfaction of finishing something quickly in an afternoon or a couple of evenings, and so that you feel inspired to keep going. Number 2, and a little bit more fun, is this flat cat toy. It also has a super clear step-by-step video tutorial that accompanies a written pattern. This will again only take you 1 or 2 afternoons and has a couple more stitches that are super basic and really easy and important for you to stay interested and learning. This is great if you do like soft toys yourself, if you have a pet that you could give this to, or a child. This pattern says that you're supposed to use a different size needle than the US 5mm and the cotton, but the thing about a plushie, same with as a dishcloth, is that the size of needle doesn't really matter. It'll just result in a slightly larger or smaller plushie, so you can go ahead and use the ones I recommended. The reason why I'm suggesting patterns that have a video and a written tutorial is that it's really important that you learn sooner rather than later how to knit following a written pattern. Vast majority of knitting patterns are written only, and they use a series of abbreviations and acronyms that otherwise would fill up like 200 pages of text if you tried to write them down. And it's not something to be scared of at all. This will help you start to get a sense of what written knitting patterns look like while having a super clear visual to go along with it that you can follow as you go. Super satisfying. You start to practice knitting and purling and a type of increase, and the final result is super cute. From there, once you feel ready to tackle a just written pattern that is written out more than your usual knitting pattern and has a bunch of photos that go along with it, I recommend this knitted headband / ear warmer by Mirella Moments. You also knit it flat, also with a combination of knit and purl stitches, which you would have practiced from the dishcloth and the cat toy. And you can wear this yourself in a variety of climates if it ever gets even a little bit cold, or give it as a gift. Once you have done at least one of those 3 knitting flat beginner patterns, I think it's high time for you to practice knitting in the round. Knitting in the round is super easy because most of the time, instead of having to knit a row and then purl a row to get that smooth stockinette finish, you have to just knit every stitch because you're always facing the same part of the knitting as you go in a spiral upwards. This also enables you to start making hats, which are, in my opinion, some of the best types of beginner projects out there and allow you to start dipping your toe into different techniques without it being a big commitment. If you want to start making different types of accessories, this is a moment to maybe go back to the store and get a soft wool blend or an acrylic yarn, because cotton isn't really good for things like hats or cowls or mittens. A pretty common, fast, satisfying, easy way to learn how to knit in the round is to start with either a circle scarf or a cowl. I recommend that you try the Cooler Side of Warm cowl / neck warmer by Espace Tricot. It's a free pattern that will only use stitches that you're already familiar with while you practice knitting in the round, and it has a pretty classic look that I think will go with the variety of outerwear options. You even start this project by working flat, aka you work across and then turn, so that you have a little bit of fabric on your needles before you start connecting in the round, which will get you out of danger of the most common mistake people make while knitting in the round, which is twisting their stitches in that first row where you can't really see what you're doing. Another warmer, climate-friendly cowl that will help you practice knitting in the round is the Oats cowl by Tin Can Knits. Tin Can Knits is a juggernaut in the learning how to knit beginner pattern space. They have a ton of free options available that will come up again from hats, cowls, and mittens. They have super clear patterns and they have a great selection of basics. This one is a little bit more interesting than maybe the Cooler Side of Warm because there is a little bit of knit purl texture. So if you're someone who quickly learns that doing the knit stitch over and over again is kind of boring for you, this might be a better option. And this one is a little bit more out there, but for those people who are really into autumn and wish it was autumn all the time, there is a pumpkin pattern, which is super basic and would not take you very long at all to work on practicing in the round. There is, again, a written tutorial and a video from Be Hooked that I think would work if you're someone who likes home decor. A slightly more involved project for knitting in the round is a hat. And I think a great place to start is this Be Hooked Crochet knitting hat pattern and video, because this will walk you through how to make a hat, and because it's a video, it'll help walk you through the only tricky part of knitting a hat in the round, which is what to do when you start decreasing to make the hat smaller at the top and your stitches don't perfectly sit around the needle and you have to start using either double pointed needles or the magic loop technique. Neither of which are very complicated or scary, but it's nice to have this video to show you what that looks like. If nothing so far is very your style, I recommend the Purl Soho Burrow hat, which is a classic cozy neutral hat pattern that just starts with a 2x2 rib as the only detail and would work up pretty quickly. Purl Soho has a lot of really good free patterns and I recommend that you look into them. If you like the look of a more fitted all over rib hat, there's also the 2x2 by Anne Gagnon, which is a solid option. That's another classic look that you could make for yourself or as a gift. And you can also do the On the Sea Train hat by Espace Tricot as well. All of these will help you practice the basic techniques of decreasing and shaping. Will all get you super wearable classic hats and are a great way to practice knitting in the round. If you have successfully created some easy accessories, a cowl, a hat, a washcloth, I think your next project is probably best suited to be a pair of mittens. Mittens will help you learn the essential skills of putting stitches on hold, picking up stitches, as well as small circumference knitting when you work on the thumb. And for that, I recommend the World's Simplest Mittens by Tin Can Knits. Again, Tin Can Knits offers patterns that are really easy to understand and geared towards beginners. Mittens are one of my favorite things to make. You don't need a lot of yarn for them. They're great gifts, and it's something that is a great combination of straightforward with enough variety to make it engaging. This is also a pattern that's been made several thousand times and goes from baby sizes to adult large men's sizes, so you can make them for yourself or for others. And if you really liked the aspect of making mittens, make a smaller project that's portable and has things change ever so slightly, ever so often to keep you engaging, you might be interested in tackling socks. Most socks are knit using much thinner needles and yarns. However, there is a free slipper sock bulky weight pattern for like a house sock or a bed sock that you might want to try, which is the Erin pattern by Linda Dubeck. These look like the kind of thing you could make in no time at all. It has a rib pattern, which means that they're more likely to fit well because rib stretches and conforms to the shape of your foot. And I think socks are the best. I always have a pair on my needles, and starting in a really big yarn will help you learn the techniques much faster and see what you're doing a lot clearly. It also means that you can rip out and redo it with a lot less pain than if you're working on 2.25 millimeter needles and itty bitty yarn. And that brings us to phase 3, which is fun techniques. At this point, if you have made at least a few of the previous types of patterns I have recommended and you're still really into knitting, take some time to think about what you actually want to be making. Look at Pinterest and Instagram and Ravelry, which is the main social media knitting site and pattern database, and find more intricate stuff that is really aspirational to you. Then look at this next part of the video and focus on the techniques that are going to help you get to eventually making that project in the future. Usually any knitting pattern will have the techniques that are used in that pattern in the listing for it, whether that says brioche or 2-color stranded color work or 6x6 cables, whatever it is. Start finding smaller patterns that include a couple of those techniques that are unfamiliar to you, so you have a low pressure, low stakes way to practice that technique before you dive headfirst into exactly what it is you want to make. I found a lot of success with this as a beginner, and I really recommend this approach to you. Okay, starting with color work. There are a few different types of color work in knitting, but for the most part, we're going to focus on stranded color work, also known as Fair Isle, where you have 2 different types of yarn going to create some type of graphic effect. The main thing here that you want to do is to pick a pattern that has no more than 5 stitch blocks of any particular color and learn how to keep your tension loose. I also recommend looking for patterns that have colorwork motifs that repeat, because that will be a lot easier to memorize, so you don't have to keep the chart open the entire time as you're going. We are also starting to move into the section where patterns are not all going to necessarily be on those 5mm needles, so you might want to start paying extra attention before you start casting on any of these. First hat that I think would be a great way to start color work is called It Points To by Amy Pelletier. The reason why I recommend it is because you just have to use 2 colors, and it looks like the color work pattern repeats the entire time, which means that you'll likely memorize it within a few rows of doing it. You'll also be able to see very clearly if you made a mistake if it follows this zigzag pattern, and these sorts of zigzags I think are very on trend right now, and you could use small amounts of really fun yarns to get a really cool effect. This is another free pattern, but it does use 5.5 and 4.5mm needles instead of the 5 that thus far have ruled the pattern recommendations I've given you. I recommend looking at the very least at the way that this pattern is written, because most colorwork patterns and cable and lace actually are written in a chart format where you look at a visual of what you're supposed to be doing and then just recreate it with your knitting. That sounds maybe kind of intimidating, but it's actually really straightforward when it comes to color work and is often easier than trying to read that in written notation. Number 2, if you have learned that you like mittens more than hats, are these Kura mittens, which have a very short color work section, and then you just switch to the second color if you're really apprehensive but you want to try. This again is something that repeats, which means it'll be very easy for you to memorize, and you're less likely to make a mistake, and you only have to use a small amount of that contrast yarn, which is great if you started to accumulate leftovers and scraps. However, again, this uses a 4mm instead of a 5. If you like more traditional patterns, you can also try the Speedy Selbu mitten pattern by Skein Knits. This is not free, but it's a very popular pattern that comes very highly reviewed. The inside of the mitten is just alternating 1 stitch in one color and the other stitch in the other color, which will give you a nice break mentally from the charted traditional Selbu rose pattern on the front. And that rose pattern repeats once. So once you've done it the first time, it'll be a lot faster to do it the second time, and then you repeat it for another mitten. If you want something a little bit less traditional, but still free if you sign up for a newsletter and using 5mm needles, I recommend the Endless Loops hat by House à la Mode. It has this repeating bow motif, which again doesn't have long sections of one color or the other, which is something that makes color work a lot harder. It is simple. You repeat the same thing over and over again, so you only have to worry about memorizing one sequence per row. It has a very cutesy, girly, on-trend bow colorwork motif, and once you have done one of those sections of bows, it seems that you'd be good for the rest of the hat and you know exactly what you're doing. And last, for patterns that will help you build essential colorwork skills to then tackle more complicated things in the future, are the Key Mittens by Petite Knit. This is again not a free pattern, but Petite Knit is the biggest knitting designer out there right now. Her patterns are pretty rigorously quality controlled. She writes clear patterns, timeless patterns, and they're usually well constructed. This has a basic 2-color repeat motif that is mostly just a stripe plus more for someone who wants to try this technique but doesn't want a very out there overall effect and would work up pretty quickly into a squishy, cozy, warm mitten. We are losing light fast, so moving into cables. Cables are classic technique associated with knitting that are a lot less complicated than you might think. Functionally, all you are doing is knitting the stitches out of order that they appear on your needles. To practice this, hats are great. Cables create a really warm, dense fabric, and people are very impressed by them, but they're not hard to do. The best pattern to practice cables at first, I think, is called Jason's Cashmere Hat. It's a free pattern. I've made it before as a gift, and it uses 5mm knitting needles. It's the same type of cable over and over and over again, which will really solidify that this is not something to be scared of as you go. It has over 10,000 projects on Ravelry, which I think lets you know how intuitive and easy this is to make. If you want something with a little bit more oomph, I recommend the Winter Cabled Beanie by Strickesstoff. I've seen quite a few people make this. It's beautiful. It has really big repeating cables across, but it's separated by big sections of seed stitch and easier, more accessible patterns that you're probably already familiar with if you don't want to do something with as many cables as the Jason's Cashmere Hat. If you like knitting socks, then I also recommend the Spruce Cable Socks by Natasha Caitlin. I haven't made this pattern by this designer, but I've made a couple other of her sock patterns, and they are very well written. This is another pattern that only has a couple cables on it, and they're very basic, the same type of cable every time, so it'll move quickly and help you establish confidence. If you want to practice cables without having to worry about any of the additional elements of decreasing at the crown of the head for a hat or any of the things that go into a heel or a toe in a sock, you also have the option of the Mirella Moments Summit Cowl, which is you knit some ribbon around, you do this cable, there's no decreasing, there's no increasing, there's no special techniques besides the cable, and then you have a warm, structured neck warmer. And cables and lace kind of go together, but if you want to focus a little bit more on lace as well, I recommend the Age of Brass and Steam Kerchief, which is a free pattern written for 5mm knitting needles, but with a kerchief or a shawl like this, it's another pattern where knitting needle size matters much less. I made one of these in a super soft yarn, and I wear it as a little kerchief, smaller than the pattern recommends, but I've tried it. It's fun, it's easy. You start at the smallest point, so you feel a lot of progress quickly as you work on that basic lace motif and practice increasing and decreasing, which are the two fundamental techniques of lace. And last, but certainly not least, garments. I think a lot of people start out knitting with the dream of making sweaters, and I promise you it is not as hard as you might fear. You will, at this point, if you have followed even loosely the syllabus I have presented to you in this video, have all the skills that you need to tackle your first sweater. You don't even really need to do a lot of the stuff that I recommended in the last phase. fun techniques in order to jump into sweaters if you have a solid understanding of how your gauge works, how to knit, purl, increase, and decrease, and you have a little bit of patience. The two sweaters I'm going to recommend first as beginner sweaters are pretty famous. They are people's go-to sweaters for a reason. Number one being the Step-by-Step sweater by Florence Miller. This has a in-depth video tutorial that goes over every single part of how to knit a sweater. Florence made this tutorial with the aim of coaching someone through their first sweater, even if they've never knit or purled before. And it comes with a written pattern, which, like I said at the beginning of the video, is important for someone who's starting out to learn how to read. There's an option for adding short rows, which just means knitting only a small portion of the larger stitches on your needle at a time, and I highly recommend adding them. They make fit a lot easier and they're nothing to be scared of. The Step-by-Step sweater is free. I've made it myself, so I can recommend it to you wholeheartedly. It uses 5mm needles, which you will be very used to, and thousands of people have made it who are complete beginners. Another option, which has been made by tens of thousands of people as their first sweater, and is a free option, and comes in everything from little baby sizes to large adult men's sizes, is the Flax by Tin Can Knits. This is a pretty basic crew neck, but it has an interesting garter panel going down each sleeve if the idea of doing the knit stitch over and over and over again makes you break out in hives. You don't have to knit either one of these, but I do recommend trying them, or at the very least, downloading the free patterns and reading through them to get a sense of what a sweater pattern looks like before moving on to others. Other sweater patterns for beginners that I recommend that aren't necessarily free but are by designers that you can trust to write well-fitting, well-described patterns are the Knit Purl Girl, the Ayasta sweater, which is knit on bigger yarn and bigger needles than anything I've really discussed thus far, which means it'll go by even faster. It's been made by a ton of beginners, including me. It's only knit and purl stitches, which makes it easy but still engaging and fun at the same time because you can count your rows and see your progress really easily. And Sophie writes incredibly detailed patterns that are pages and pages long and explain in detail every little thing that goes into the pattern. Another Knit Purl Girl sweater that is very beginner friendly is the Cove sweater, which offers a drop shoulder construction, which means you start up here and you knit the back and the front separately, and then you join in the round at the underarms, which means you do a lot of knitting flat, which is something you'd be used to as a beginner. If you live in a warmer climate or you're watching this in the summer, I do recommend the Drinks on the Patio crop top by Shanna K. Salmon. I knit mine on 5mm needles with the yarn that she recommended, and that's where I got gauge for that myself. I've made two. These are really fast, really straightforward, and super wearable tops, and a great way to make your first ever garment without having to have all the time commitment of a sweater. Other designers that I recommend for your first sweater are Lily Kate France. I love her designs. She is so clever and such a strong communicator when explaining instructions, and her Wishful sweater has a very loose gauge, which means you don't have to have a lot of stitches to get very far in the pattern, which means it will work up really quickly, have a beautiful feminine timeless result, and without a lot of unusual techniques that will be unfamiliar to you. And before we lose the light entirely, the last designer that I recommend for your first garment is Petite Knit. Like I mentioned when I was talking about her mittens, Petite Knit is the most popular knitting designer right now for a reason, and she has a whole line on her website of recommended beginner patterns. A couple that I would like to highlight are the Louisiana sweater, which is knit on big yarn and big needles, so it goes by quickly and you have the satisfaction of learning how to knit a sweater without it taking several months. I also recommend her Novice line, which also include a sweater and a slipover or vest, which again, if you live in a warmer climate or you don't think you'll have the patience or the confidence for a full sweater, a vest is another solid option. And that is it. That is everything I have for you on how to stop brain rot, start knitting, Knitting 101. I hope that you found this useful, and let me know if this has added anything to your to knit list as a beginner. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll talk again soon. Okay, bye.